really almost our kind of final installment. We may have a final conversation in about an hour and maybe field some questions if we still have folks on site. But it's been a really stimulating day of just some tremendous conversations, all part of the Digital Global Symposium, hosted here in our little intimate setting of the Athenaeum, or of the Digital Commons for Humanities and Arts. The tea that we all just had was hosted by the Athenaeum Press, and the organization, the main organization of this, credit goes to Dr. Tripti Pillai and the Arts and Humanities Global Experience Program. So for this segment, and this will kind of follow chronologically the talks that we had today, we're having a very kind of informal discussion. There'll be some prefacing sort of presentations, but of student work and how student work kind of intersects with this theme that we've been talking about all day, the digital global, across so many disciplines and so many different registers. So I'm joined today by Brooke Leiby, a graphic design major who works with the Athenaeum Press, and what he was just sharing with me has been kind of a life-transforming experience on the Sandy Island project, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
And you're going to talk to us a little bit about that. And then Shante Clement is a major in digital culture and design, who is also now an AGEP fellow. And an ambassador. So we have an intersection between these two. I'm going to ask you to just talk about your work a little bit, and then, Brooke, so you're going to go first,
okay.
But then Shante, maybe you can segue us in, and this will allow us to have a bigger discussion as people kind of traipse in about maybe some of the things you heard today in relationship to your own work. So take us away, Brooke.
Okay. So I'm Brooke Leiby. I work at the Press on the Sandy Island project as a videographer and video editor. With these skills going to this community that I really didn't know existed until the project started, until I was asked to be part of the project, was a very influential experience. Be able to see it through a lens, but also through my eyes, and try to tell their story in the most immersive way possible. Definitely pulled a curve towards what I was expecting this project to be. So I'm going to go ahead and start sharing real quick.
Yep, there you go, you're all good.
And part of what we produced, I think the final product, we did a book as well as a episodic documentary series that had 3 virtual reality episodes, which is kind of the crux of the entire project in terms of technology, and also my introduction to VR, which was a pretty good milestone in terms of what I've worked with before and what I believe for the press as well. And just to start off, I'd like to show you guys a traditional trailer that we put together for the documentary aspect of the project.
Right. Should there be sound with this?
There should be.
Okay, so if you go to
Okay.
if you go to your settings,
Mm-hmm.
we can edit this out so it's not a concern. Go to your settings on your computer,
System preferences.
and then under sound it'll say output, and you want to click share.
There it is.
Should have told you that before. This is what editing software is for.
Yeah. There we go. Okay, it's working now. I'll go ahead and start it over.
Mm-hmm.
Sound is pretty important.
Well, when I came here, the only difference was, it reminded me of home. walking soul will not stop it from there.
So that trailer was pretty much a summary of what the project as a whole meant, or what the story we were trying to tell was. So it starts at the beginning with the travel to the island. The only way to get there is by boat, which inspired the VR aspect later on in the production process. So on this trip there in the trailer, you hear this compilement of voices, starting from one voice. Says it reminds me of home. It's a home for a dense population of people that has dwindled to a very small number, which that comes full circle at the end of the trailer, with sort of like metaphorical use. But with the use of voice and kind of like the muddlement of all these different layers of people speaking kind of represents how this community has been kind of spoken over, in terms of their needs and how they've been falsely influenced by the outside communities. And then their church life becomes kind of like their driving force, like the hope of the island. And with that fading into the gospel music aspect, and then to Voices of Children, kind of leads from where they start to their hope of the present to the future, which is the children of the island, who seem to be leaving and getting jobs elsewhere, starting lives outside of the island, and kind of leaving their community behind, which driving force of the project is the children and keeping the community going. So with that, we wanted to show people what it was like to get to the island. And with that, we created a virtual reality experience on a boat with Charles Pyatt, one of the community leader of the island, driving from the mainland, from a dock they have on the mainland, where they have cars parked, where they drive to their work and other outside departments, to their home. So I'll go ahead and play that for you, show you how that is like. So this experience is fully in the round. There's Charles Pyatt. Back there you can see the mainland dock with the school boat that's used to transport children as well as older community members. And these little windows give you kind of a peek into the traditional video and the immersion experience. Just kind of add another layer of information aside from text and the background information. some landmarks. Right here is their only convenience store / market on the island. They have simple things there, simple commodities like foods. It's Charles White that runs it. Again, the old school boat, named after the founder of the island, Charles' home, just to show how close they are to the river. And that is the first episode of the VR series. Just to kind of show like their daily transport. That's to and from the island, that same route. And it's actually a dangerous route. There have been many drownings in that span of the river, and also they had an old dock connected to Brooklyn Gardens that they don't use anymore. That was even more dangerous. It was a longer route whenever they just used paddle boat. This was like before motors, or before they had access to motors. So from that, the traditional aspects of that, just for a break from the immersive experience, because it's going to be kind of disorienting. With these, especially as like a first-time producer of this kind of content, I found that it takes some perfection to get it just right. And after like looking back at it now, seeing sort of technical flaws that of course come on your first time of producing such content, and then looking at the traditional aspect. This one being my personal favorite episode of the traditional content of the oldest member of the island. She's Anita Elliott. I believe she's 102 or 103 now. Just talking about rice and the before and after of what she's seen through her.
Sweet rice, nice rice. Take the rice, tie it, after cut it, take a hand person and tie it, and do the trash and have a long can, tie on, then you take them, put them over here, then you trash the rice, add it, then you put them in have a mortar of that time. When you put it in there, have a pepper, you heat that way. But it was the best thing, better than the ratio he's done. My home, I was born and raised here, and I love it. Regardless of where I go, I want to come back to Sandia. I love it because I was born and raised on Sandia. Nowhere I love but here.
I was going to ask you, what's the secret to living to be 102 years old?
Huh?
What's your secret to living to be 102 years old?
Lord, bless me. That's all I thank the Lord for left me live that long. But I don't know if the Lord's secret, not mine, because I don't know.
She was also kind of a driving point that kind of, I feel like she represented a lot of what the project as a whole was trying to say. Her being one of the only remnants of the past that saw the history of the island grow over a period of time, the knowledge of the rice plantation production, as well as being connected to the founder of the island, the free slave groups that built up the community.
So before we switch gears a little bit and we get into a discussion, can you talk a little bit about this juxtaposition or this tension even, because you can tell it was a difficult process, between the virtual, and talking a lot about sort of the problematics and the powers of virtual kinds of representations, and the more you've used the word traditional. Can you talk a little bit about that?
So my use of the word traditional versus the virtual aspect goes between the idea of the picture plane. So with the traditional video, we have this limited space to view the content, just the single frame limited by the border of the actual screen. In the virtual aspect, it's in the round. So you're seeing practically everything that the camera can show you, obviously. And it's that immersive aspect that you don't get with traditional video that I think was very important for this project, just to show more than what the limiting perspective can. And even with this, trying to keep the camera moving as much as possible, not static. I don't think there was one shot in the traditional footage that we captured that was static, completely stripping away what would be used to make it as like a cinematic shot, to use quotes, and just using it bare bones, kind of like how the island was using their resources, just using the camera to tell as true of a story as possible. And with that contrasting with the virtual, that kind of became a conflict in that, because while you're showing more in terms of visual content, you're still creating a barrier, because at first it's like, oh, this is crazy, I'm seeing everything here, and I feel like kind of produces a veil, and applying the source material of Onethia and the different chapters, homemaking, future of the children, I mean, even the travel on the river has a lot of weight to it. And just reinforcing that with as much diverse content as possible, music, text, even just the voices. The subtitle of the project was Voices of Sandy Island. So we just wanted to, for the most part, let the island speak for itself and try and make the technical aspect as less of a barrier as possible, just to show their voice and try and not make it as, I guess the word could be, artificial.
Mm-hmm. So this is good. I think this is a good transition point. We'll come back to you, I'm sure, as we have conversations, because I think you're going to talk about things that deal with this in some, if I'm not mistaken.
It could be some aspect of it, yes.
Shantae Clement, off you go.
So my project, I'm Shantae, by the way. I'm a digital culture design student, and one of my driving forces for being in my major and being interested in what I like, which is primarily video game spaces and video games representation, is effectiveness and how those virtual spaces can affect you emotionally. So I think it kind of ties into what Mr. Livey is talking about when you're trying to kind of put someone in a virtual space and actually emotionally affect them instead of like overwhelming them and trying to make it seem artificial, which is what digital spaces are, is artificial. So what I was focusing on is how in video games they're very effective emotionally, but really there's no reason why they are, or at least there's no spoken reason why they are. It's not very like noticeable unless you're really looking at it. So I wanted to kind of demonstrate those. So I have this, I call it a virtual walkthrough. This is a bunch of different rooms that you can walk through, and there's text on the wall that basically explains to you what's happening, because there's the actual enactment of walking through the space, and then there's feeling the space, and those are kind of different. So this is just a basic storage room. I just wanted some like a neutral space that people don't really have much familiarity with if you don't know what it, like how to work in a warehouse or something. But so I just wanted to show how it's not very effective because you're in there and it's like, okay, there's boxes and it's concrete and maybe it's boring and underwhelming basically. And so if you bring in sound, it provides a context to that space, because spaces in video games or even virtual spaces act as containers for stories. And if you don't have a very effective space in emotional wise and realism, like with an E, so effective, it doesn't really provide much to the user for that experience. So if you add contextualized space with like sound and atmosphere and things in real space that we look for to know that this space is kind of complete, then your virtual space won't really be as compelling or as effective as a container for the story you're trying to convey. And it was very difficult to get this to work, so it's really wonky. And if I went back, I could probably do it better. But first time's a charm. So in this space, or with this project, I want to talk about how sound design and atmosphere are one of the most kind of key components to how a space is effective. So if you walk into a room, what you notice is how you feel in that space and what your senses are picking up. So you're going to notice the lighting, and if the lighting is warm, you're going to feel warm in that room. And if the lighting is colder, or you're going to feel like, oh, well, this is a sterile place, I should kind of reserve myself. So the cues that you get from the room tell you how you should react or interact with that space. And it'll also tell you how to interact with the story of that space. So when they were talking about Manokti was talking about the VR Museum of Fine Art, I noticed in the kind of trailer for the kind of virtual space, it was like there was neutral white walls, and there was lighting that was focused on the figures, and it was very reminiscent of a museum space, because in museum space you act a certain way because the space tells you to be reserved and respectful of the artifacts that are there. So for this, I wanted to focus on how your schema of what a living room is like will tell you about that space. So there's birdsong in the background, and there's the warm lighting, and it's not really overwhelming, but it's also not unpleasant. So even if the space isn't really designed with a bunch of realism or anything, you can still associate it with a living room space, and you start to think about how your living room is and how you feel in that space.
And if I may interrupt just for a minute, just because you have mentioned, if I'm correct, you're doing a critical project where you go into all the different aspects of analyzing this, but your analysis is on the walls. Is that correct? You've integrated that into?
Yes.
Yeah.
So the UI for that, I wanted to make it where you could interact with the space more by picking up paper, and you could do that, but my technical skills at that time were not that good. I'll try to revamp it, I guess, if I go along with it. But I wanted to kind of tell people what was happening when they're interacting with the space, because we know that ambient noises make us feel comfortable, and if they're gone, then we feel unsure of that space as a realistic space, or even just uncomfortable with that space because it doesn't fit what we assume a realistic space to feel like. So virtual spaces have the tendency or even the capacity to affect us in ways when they mess with or even align with what we assume regular spaces to feel like. And that's why I wanted to highlight what I was intentionally doing from the changes, because these are all the same three spaces, but I just tweaked them in order to bring up a more effective experience, which is why in the text, I don't know if you can see it, but it's the lighting is nice and warm, there's birdsong, and so there's positive in terms of effectiveness. It reminds you of home and a living room that you would be experienced with, and that effectiveness kind of relies on schemas and what you assume a space is like in order to really impact you emotionally. And then I go into the next one. It takes so long. And so this space is very unpleasant. And even if it's not the most technically disturbing space, there's nothing visual that really disturbs you, but the atmosphere and the sound design suggests that the space is different from the prior space. So it really goes into the idea that when our schemas are messed with, or even the schema of walking through your house at night and you're oh, it's creepy in here, I don't want to go back to my bed. So it's you can even pull on schemas of certain situations in order to affect people. So everyone had one of my I guess note cards on the wall says that everyone can relate to being in a house at night and being scared someone's going to jump out at you. And then you have the creepy movies that really play into the old house with the large clocks, and there's weird music in the background, and it's late at night and you have a flashlight. You have to defend against whatever creatures are in the dark. So it's pulling into that idea that when spaces match certain assumptions that you have about spaces, or expectations that you have from a space that can affect you even more and do very little themselves. So I didn't do much. I just changed the music and the lighting and gave a sort of filter that light can go through. But in doing that, you conjure up other images of that, so it affects you more with doing less.
Can I ask you a question or make a statement? I think it's so cool that you started out your presentation by talking about conceding that this is fake. Virtual places are by definition fake. And what I think is so interesting about this is the way you're not trying to transcend the artifice. You're trying to work intentionally within the limitations of the artifice. Because I've got kids, so I watch a lot of animation. And it seems to me that the least successful animated worlds are the ones that try to go for too believable. They try to make people that look too much like people, and in doing that, they fail. And because they can't do it exactly, we are reminded of the artifice. So it seems like what you want to do is to create a world that does not represent real life, but is believable in terms of the rules of its own world. And so I love the way that you can, first of all, I love this word effectiveness instead of believability or realism, because I think effectiveness might be the word for what I'm saying. It's believable and it affects you on its own universal terms. So I love the idea that instead of trying to make it real, fully, you bring in like two things, like the bird song, the lighting, the ornamentation of the red vases or whatever, and it's a gesture toward real. It's just really cool the way, this reminds me that to get realness is not to be more real, but to be more fully immersed in the world that you've created.
It's really amazing that you bring this up because Shante referenced earlier Gabrielle Minotti's piece, who is a person who works with 3D replication technologies, and his whole project is really what you just described as a political intervention. So he goes into the kind of very stale, sterile, very white normative spaces of museums and their 3D artifacts, and starts to populate that with places from, he comes from this very small town in Portugal, Portugal or Brazil? Brazil, very small town in Brazil that has had all these problems with gentrification and threw these people out of these places that they lived in, and they tried to turn it into a museum. He goes back in, he picks up these everyday objects and he keeps them in their tattered form because he's using technologies in that space that don't have the really good connections. And what he's doing is not trying to mirror the 3D replications and saying, here's counter life. He's drawing attention to the rules of the artifice for all of these, right? And he's doing it as a political activity. So what you just described is the political aesthetics of Minotti, and what you're doing with your studies in effectiveness, more or less, right? Yeah.
Yeah, but definitely, like there's something interesting about artificiality in the fact that it can be so similar to real life and then be completely unbelievable, and in the bad way, but like
It
it
can
can't
be less powerful the more closely it resembles the real.
In order for it to actually teach us something about real life, we need to recognize that it is not real.
Right.
And it's funny that you bring up animation, because one of the things about animation, I think I did a project on it, or like a blog post or something in one of our classes. I was talking about how animation doesn't really need to be lifelike in order to be effective, because of the way that you kind of let down your guards in order to enjoy this like simple sort of innocuous media, and then it allows you to like change your perspective without getting you riled up and defensive and everything.
Right.
So I made this so that you could see different environments and how you could tweak them with just the simple things of what you expect in a space. So like lighting and sound design and ambient noises and everything. So this is a forest walk. And usually when you're in media, since I was dealing with video games, usually in a forest, you have a video game, there's a forest in it. Either somebody's going to be murdered, or there's you're a little girl walking through the woods, like on a picnic date or something. So there's limited amounts of schemas that are positive for certain spaces, but you could subvert that by using different I guess different sounds to different effects. So like the bird song in this and the lighting is really positive, and so you think it's just like a nice walk in the woods. It's gonna take me a very long time to get to the back of this because I didn't do very good planning, but just more so I wanted to create the illusion of, or just bring attention to the illusion that virtual spaces can have, because I think it's very powerful if you can render a human experience in a non-human form, or even just a non-organic form, like the internet and virtual spaces and 3D modeling.
Well, and Brooks, this kind of relates to what you were talking about, where you were kind of crossing over a little bit when you were talking about the project and saying, and you were talking about like kind of the traditional offers this like kind of favorite moment for you because it's very representative, and you kind of imaginatively kind of cover those gaps. When you move to the 360, we think, oh wow, it's immersive. But as you point out, you use the term veil. You're creating more barriers around that, right? I mean, it's not like we're giving you real life. We're giving you the authentic experience, right? You're remediating it at a whole other level. And there's choices involved in that, right? With ethical ramifications, I would imagine, right? And I imagine you felt that a lot in the project.
For sure, yeah. And it definitely created a boundary to try and pass, and I feel like we succeeded in a way. A lot of the reactions were extremely positive, and not just with the technical impression that is VR, just the experience itself and what people actually took away from it actually seemed to be pretty positive, and the majority,
yeah,
which is exactly what we wanted.
One thing I find interesting though is both of you have commented on like the flaws. I think you even said I could do it better if I had more time, and you mentioned, I'm seeing all these flaws now. But when Minote, is that his name, was talking, he said he left the flaws in there because at first he thought about getting rid of them.
Yep.
But they are the scars of the process, and it's just this reminder that it is not the actual object, but it is a replica. And I think especially when you're dealing with somebody's culture, like with Sandy Island, I think it's necessary to keep that separation. Otherwise, because I have this whole issue with like commodifying people's cultures, but it's like, listen, we are documenting it, and this is not to say that it is an exactness, it's not real, but it is a representation.
And that there's labor in there, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah.
He talked about how hard it was to do in that environment because they didn't have the access to the resources that somebody at the Museum of Art, at the British Museum has, right? And so he was doing it with all these really clunky technologies, and it was really laborious and really time-consuming. And he talked about that kind of, the pain of all of that, as he talked about it almost as part of sort of kind of intervening in this process and the illusions we have about it.
Yeah. And even, I'm sorry I missed your talk, and almost all of yours. But, what Minote is saying is interesting in I don't know if it is strategic leaving incomplete or strategic scars that are left out of the perfect vision or the perfect mediated experience. But there is also a sense that even the real thing, right, fails to communicate the scars of process and all the unnamed, invisible, non-tactile experiences that have gone into just constructing that and preserving it. So in some ways, even saying that these moments or these things that you notice are imperfections could become a way in which you could draw attention to how perfection is also this grand artifice, right, which really works outside of realms of reality, or the real.
As Shantae takes us through this threshold of...
I know, lots and lots of trees.
I'm going to have to take off. Thank you so much. This is great.
Thank you for visiting.
Thank you.
I like this feeling.
Yeah.
It's like, this is the perfect evening.
The quality of this is actually really good. I've been playing Skyrim VR, and it's every bit as good as this.
See?
Well, I'm glad, but no, I'm very glad. But speaking of labor, I really resonated with that because I could appreciate the fact that just because it's poor quality and the fact that it isn't like as grand as an institution would have it, like the British Museum has a lot more resources than Minoshi did doing this project, in the way that it was kind of indicative of the kind of resistant labor that went into it, the sort of like grassroots labor that went into it. So I really didn't think about it like that, but it is very interesting how those flaws can kind of talk about the even just like socioeconomic status
Absolutely.
of the
Exactly.
project.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And all those erasures and smoothings are their attempts, and we've heard it in every one of the talks today. We heard it in financial capital. We heard about it in terms of aesthetic cultural representation. And I missed Lee's talk, but I'm sure there was. I mean, that was a thread through all of it. And of course, in many ways, that's what Jay is doing is reclunkifying the aesthetics, if you will, of some of this, right, in really productive ways. Wow, this is great. This is really wonderful stuff.
So we were talking. I remember one of our. I went to Goldsmiths with Dr. Trippi. She's a wonderful woman. Wanted to take me, but so one of our workshops was about surfaces and how a surface is not an innocuous kind of neutral feature of an object, but is a kind of link to its deeper meaning in the container of whatever it is. And so that can work with physical things like statues was the context of post-communist Bulgaria and like communist statues in that context and how they affect the space, the landscape that they're in, and put a different kind of story or like atmosphere to the space that they can are held within. But you can do that with anything. So like the surface of a digital space is reminiscent of what that physical space would be like. So if you were recreating, let's say like an amphitheater in ancient Greece or Rome, that surface of that would not only be historical, but also the context of what was happening and why it was made and all of that. So it's really interesting how, I guess, virtual spaces can really like not toy with our minds, but kind of influence us to perceive them in a certain way.
Right, absolutely, and I think that went back to one of the things I was saying to Jay about flatness, right? I mean, flatness is not this sort of erasure, and it's a process, it's a procedure, but it's a procedure that points to exactly what you were describing, these different types of containers, and the containers that sort of exist behind the containers, and attention to the container itself, because we are particularly living at a moment where, the container, there's so much attempt, and of course, Conrad's talk was very much about that, in arguing that his critical project is in many ways sort of looking at the container, this whizzing, blurring, rapidly processing container of financial capital, and the power of that is a kind of aesthetics. Absolutely, yeah.
And even so when we think of surfaces, and I think the presentation you're talking about, she was using a philosopher and activist, Felix Guattari's concepts of what it means to investigate and interrupt spaces and surfaces. But there is also this notion that smooth spaces and striated spaces, right? So there are these spaces which striated spaces have a sense of vertical hierarchies, right? There's one on top of the other, on top of the other. So there's this layering, which suggests that what is beneath the surface is the real deal, right? The meat. As opposed to this idea of the smooth surface where you really cannot tell where the surface, is there anything below the surface, becomes in itself questionable, right? And if the surface has layers over it or beneath it or around it, it's
the Mobius strip.
Right. It's the impossibility of finding its boundaries is what makes it really radical.
Yep.
That's why I thought Jay's use of flat techniques was really radical in that it is reclaiming vanilla, right? And it's making vanilla a very dangerous thing. It's not changing vanilla. It's just making vanilla dangerous in a way that vanilla has very strategically suggested the things below it are the dangerous things.
Yeah, and using that even at an embodied level to reinscribe absences. So, as Jay said at one point, I could actually lay down with my body in this, but then took the body back out.
Right, yeah.
Right? So playing with that at kind of an embodied level, too, is really interesting. This has been a fabulous day.
It has been a really good day.
Um,
I feel very rewarded.
And I think rather than, because this has been our kind of student panel presentation, but I think rather than going into kind of even maybe a summation at this point of some highlights or thoughts.
Thought about it, yeah.
Brooks is doing such interesting work with the press. Of course, was not able to see the presentations today, but what you're talking about really resonates with a lot of what we talked about and discussed today across the board. I'm fascinated by this. I thought it was really interesting. And this almost sounds like a very pedestrian comment, but I think it really relates to kind of some of the things that we're talking about in a practical sense. Several of our presenters, all very, very far away in terms of physical distance, said they'd never done anything like this before. It was kind of a new experimentation. So here we are.
Yeah, I know.
In a virtual digital moment, and we're still flying on the planes.
Yeah.
David Lodge, who's a satirist about academic spaces, has this book called Small World, and he says, and fly, 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 they go. He's making fun of academics, and they're getting on their planes and flying places and flying back to places, and the carbon footprint following them across the Atlantic and transatlantic. And it's really interesting to me that in some ways, everybody that we had represented here today and involved in these discussions is really at the forefront of these conversations. And they all pointed to how far behind the curve we are in terms of thinking about these things, having a vocabulary for them, even at the most practical level, that it hasn't occurred to us more often to do these kinds of virtual symposiums.
Right. I mean, yeah, really. That was, I mean, when Jen and I were thinking about this, one of my concerns was just, oh man, I mean, I don't know how a virtual symposium or a strong component of virtual symposium is going to work out in terms of success, right? That how is the experience going to feel? David Lodge is writing about people like me, right? I take the little carbon print and go and talk.
As do I.
I'm going to read my paper too, damn it, and you can make eye contact
That's
with
right.
me.
And I'm going to do it again,
right,
in a few months.
yeah.
So, it's not like we've abandoned it. Yeah.
And yet, the idea that this was perhaps the more, and I do not like this word diverse, but it was where the totally different approaches to similar sufficiencies, insufficiencies, and hypersufficiencies of the digital and the global were being brought together, right? So I was really thinking there was a starting point of the archive, right? So Menotti started talking about archiving, and Jay was talking about, again, archiving, and it's sort of a rigorous documenting, right, and unsentimental documenting. And Lee is also talking about how we really must document the female body being trafficked in multiple media, including the digital media, which is becoming so much more thorough than literal mediations or literal traffickings. And then Conrad talking also. And it occurred to me that what the medium really allowed us to do, or what the symposium and specifically its iteration allowed us to do, is think about the messiness, right, of the differences. What you just said so articulately about the this is before the lexicon, right? The language has not been constructed for the experiences yet. And what these architects are doing is struggling to come up with a language. And we were part of that conversation, which made me feel really, as I said, rewarded.
Absolutely. And these are new struggles and old struggles. So simultaneous, and based on the point you just made about diversity, one of the things that I see unfolding in early modern studies right now is that there's this huge, almost seemingly antiquated embattlement about diversity. Medieval studies, across the board about sort of diversity, because these absences, these gaps, these separations, these erasures are being made reapparent again by the use of digital technologies and social media and transmission tools that are in these virtual spaces.
Yeah.
And so it's almost like it's re-amplifying the fact that we're despite all of our conversations about sort of superseding those spaces, they're still there. The issues are still there with them.
Right.
And to be, this is, I guess, a Donna Haraway expression from her latest book, to be in the trouble, staying with the trouble.
Yeah.
This kind of thing is a new kind of staying with the trouble, of troubling the spaces and the boundaries, the erasures, the deceptions of these surfaces. And it is exciting.
Yeah, it is
Yeah.
really,
I
really
find
exciting.
it extra fascinating because it literally just came at the best time because I just got into ODU, and most people have been very congratulatory, but they've also expressed skepticism because it's technically an online program, but I will essentially be Skyping into the classroom. It's not
Right.
like one of those learn as you go type things. I'm video chatting into the room with other students, and yet people are still very critical of it. Like that's not really going to the program. And yet, it's just, I think, because it troubles their space. It troubles their understanding of what it is to have that experience. And I'm like, well, I don't care. But at the same time, I think this whole symposium was perfect. And I'm like, there's no way I'm missing it because not only is it on a topic I'm going to be working on anyway, it's using the methodology that I'm going to be. And so I'm like, if it's good enough to have this type of conversation, then it's good enough for me to get my education.
Yeah, and I think even like if we take out the good enough, right, that again leads to thinking that, so now it'll sound really ditzy, but it's the evening, so it's okay.
No, we've been going since, for the record, because this is being recorded for the archive, we've been going since 10 o'clock this morning.
Yes.
Yes. And we have been, Skyping in. And by the way, very timely. The problem with conferences is that they're never on time, and somebody ends up not getting to present their work. And they commented on the fact that we were on the money because
we were going.
Yes, so that was another.
And that, again, I mean, in real time, navigating. I don't want to call it egos that just become physical, right, in their refusal to leave the stage. That's a little more complicated than here, just waving, saying, "It's 15 minutes, time to wrap up."
We're going to pull the plug on you.
Or just
Literally.
hang up. Hello.
We're involved in a student. We're recording a student conversation right now.
Yeah, you had a question, and maybe you should bring it up.
Yeah. So this is an opportunity
Yeah.
to do this. This
No,
is the
there's-
more informal of.
I kind of want to ask her why does it have to be termed professional girlfriend, because I have a problem with that kind of.
That is the going language. That's not her term. That's what they're called.
Yeah, I just kind of want to get on that topic. I was like, that don't sound good. That don't sound professional at all.
Well, I kind of think it goes to that the digital has this ability to make these girls, these women invisible. And it does so by playing with the language, I think. I'm going to call you the professional girlfriend because now you're not a slave, an escort and all of these things. So we're going to make you invisible because people aren't going to pay attention to the professional girlfriend.
Right, but even a word like escort, right? I mean, what is escort if not professional girl? They're all euphemisms, right?
Just for the record, I'm going to intervene here for a
Yes.
moment because we will edit this, but I've just some signposts. We've been having one discussion. Another digital culture and design student, new one, just entered with a question that I believe is about Lee McKinnon's presentation. So the question, if you want to go back and check within the archive on Lee McKinnon's presentation, I believe this question relates to that.
Is relevant to that exactly. But I mean, in some ways, Lee's point was precisely that we use a sort of mundane language to cleanse and sanitize the reality which predates modernity, that way predates the internet and digital environments of trafficking, which is that the female body, and she did say that when we hear female, think the coded body, right? The body that is used as a natural resource. That body is only valuable insofar as it is willing to be exploited, right? Because how we make that body exploitable has changed, but the body's bodiness does not change, right? And I think that's where even the fact that you're balking and you're disgusted by that problematic professional girlfriend concept, I think that's exactly what she was drawing attention to that it is deeply problematic, and perhaps more problematic because now being professional and being a girlfriend are both considered acceptable for the female body, right? So coupling it together just makes it sound okay for anyone to continue exploiting the body.
I still kind of say it sounds okay to me, but that's not for me to call.
Well, I think you're responding to something that she's critically assessing, and you're offering your kind of you're offering an example of an affective response to something that was being sort of critically framed. And so I think, and I don't want to speak for her or you, but I think Lee would say exactly, right?
Yeah.
You know, that's exactly the feeling. That's what I'm critically examining in that context.
Yeah, she's just as disgusted or finding it problematic as you are.
Yeah.
Right. But the reality is, when we say, and that's why she was drawing attention also to sugar babies, right? When we say sugar mama or sugar daddy, or give me some sugar, we have become so comfortable with that problematic language and the history that she really uprooted and showed us, that it connects to sugar plantations, right? And whoever owned those sugar plantations was the sugar daddy, and whatever was there for trafficking became the sugar, right? So when we say sugar daddy now, we are completely divorced from that history. Just like when we hear professional, you, and I feel quite comfortable saying the rest of the audience here, feels disgusted by this combination of professional girlfriend. But those that are embedded in that community, right, of purchased intimacy,
And those
are okay with that.
And those histories and those erasures, we saw them even being made in rapid real time in the present when we started to talk about algorithms. And the fact that algorithms are argued for is this very sterile mathematical space that don't have biases, that don't have, it's just math being enacted. And then the idea has been, once they get connected with social networks, or they get connected with cultural networks and other kinds of influences, but really, from the get-go, the algorithm itself. And I think that's really something that I really enjoyed about Conrad's piece, was pointing to the fact that the substrate's already there, right? And I used the calculus as the example because calculus came up in the other. Calculus is already represented by Newton in a very Western framework coming out of a Middle Eastern framework, right? It isn't that calculus was given us to us as this flat ontology that doesn't already have these kinds of biased substrates.
And also the assumptions made that math, right? That math is this rational language, and math is what the West has epitomized as rational and difficult, right? I mean, I say this in my class, you can't not be a math person. You've just been trained to not be a math person. It's like when people say, I'm not a visual thinker, or I'm only a visual thinker. No, all these institutions have worked to isolate you from multimodal ways of thinking.
The
right?
elitism and the Enlightenment, right?
Yeah. So it's like, and going back to what I was saying when you walked in, right? The archive and scholarship kind of work in ways to isolate people from buildings, right? So Renaissance scholars, the real Renaissance scholar, right? Not the surface one, the real one, goes literally into the basements of libraries and sits in musty corners and, is like inhaling the ashes of books. That's archive fever. But the real hierarchy of scholarship means that somebody who does not have access to that archive can never be a Renaissance scholar, right? And these are the environments. What ODU is modeling right now is something which enables a Renaissance scholar to be born in Nepal, right? And that, I think, is
and the
very
archive
powerful.
experience, the physical archive experience, still is a very powerful experience. But on the other side too, the reality, you talk about the stack of this counter positioning or juxtapositioning of the authentic academic space versus where you're just going to be online, ignoring entirely the fact that contemporary academic institutions have become entirely privatized. They're run by companies. They're no longer these austere, darkened towers of enlightenment and private. They've literally become. You just use the word commodity. They've been commodified, and they're commodified spaces to the extreme. So they themselves are already virtualized as part of 21st century capitalism. So that in itself is a really sort of interesting.
The most popular hybrid course going out of Harvard is one that is taught by one of the great Shakespeareans. She's fabulous, Marjorie Garber. But it is a course that is online, and the largest demographic that signs up for that course comes out of South Asia.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, and the kind of money pouring in from South Asia into Harvard, it's ridiculous, right? I mean, it's out of control. So when Dr. Boyle is talking about the fact that even an institution, the brick and mortar institution, is a virtual body now, and it's really relying on its fragmented identity. It's so profoundly true that the ivory tower does not exist because the ivory tower has itself dismantled itself, right? So you can have a little piece of this tower for $1,000,000.
Right. And that fragmentation that was talked about by Ramon, right? We want that piece of you that wants the cat videos, when the cat videos are needed for the commodification. So we want that piece of you that wants to think about the dusty, sort of garret of scholarly pursuit, when we need that fragmented piece to kind of put into circulation. But the thing itself is not this kind of totalized whole that's absent of virtualities, right? Even though we keep pointing back to them over and over again. Well, we're almost at an hour, and I know that, I could go on forever, but I will say I found this so productive and provocative, and I want to thank you for this this collaboration because it's just been fantastic. We thought it was a what if, and we didn't even know if it was going to work. We didn't know if the technology was going to hold up. We thought we'd get maybe one-to-one installment of this and things would start short-circuiting and the technology would fail. We had almost no...
Seamless.
Yeah.
I didn't know Conrad wanted his presentation up and running.
But you got it up there and we got it ready.
Eventually, it was like, oh my God, where is it?
Yeah, and we saved a little bit of carbon in the atmosphere and in a very small way. And I found it to be just really steamy. And it seemed that our guest presenters really got a lot out of it, too.
A lot of them have already emailed to say this is so fabulous.
Yes.
And I'm very glad.
So I'm going to just say it right now on camera for recording. I think that we ought to make this an annual thing now, that because digital culture and design is very early in its age. We're only a couple years old as a degree program, really technically. We have some fabulous people involved in it. The press and the kind of work you're doing is very new, hasn't been around that long, and AGAP is an emerging entity as well. So maybe this is something that we can make a signature collaboration of all these initiatives
It'll be really,
on an annual basis.
I mean, it'll be really great if we can have symposia that kind of break symposium culture.
Yeah.
Monumental symposiums are being destroyed.
Yeah.
You can just show up and be expert.
I actually like this setup better than the actual in space.
Yeah.
I enjoyed it more.
Yeah, and you feel like there's a kind of both formalism because you're worried about time and calling somebody at the right moment, but it's also more relaxed at the same time if you sneak out because
Right, and just some strange things, not glitches, but I think interruptions are so helpful, right? So when Minotti was talking, he was like, oh, I'm sorry, that was my buzzer going off, right? And Lee was talking and her orchids were like hitting her on the face. And like she was like really stretching her collar and she was like, I wanted to wear a really formal thing, but then I got cold and I just had like this tracksuit jacket and she wore it. And Jay, while we were watching their film,
put on a sweater.
Decided that enough is enough. I'm gonna rock my sweater. And I think those interruptions are not. I mean, when they happen. So just to juxtapose, and I don't know. Well, this is gonna be on record. I don't care. So I was at the Shakespeare Association of America's conference a couple of years back, like big shots, giving big talks, and one of the speakers, one of the plenaries, who was going to talk about Hamlet and 21st century practices in pedagogy, Linda Charnas, she's at the University of India, really fantastic, and she fainted literally on stage, not for any nervousness or anything. She was just dehydrated, and the podium was hitting her diaphragm in this really uncomfortable area, and she just had a physical response, right, to the discomfort. And it occurred to me that everybody forgot how brilliant her talk was, and all they talked about was
Her fainting.
this interruption, right? And it's because we have made the real environment interruption-free, where interruptions are rude and cannot happen.
Yeah.
What do you mean there is a cat meowing in the back
Yeah.
when you're talking, right? Whereas these virtual spaces allow for those interruptions to be part of the genre, which I think is really cool. That we do have to realize that there are multiples. I mean, schizophrenia is what we really inhabit. Yeah, my cat is meowing. It's hungry.
Yeah.
And I'm dealing with you guys trying to look professional in a really tight T-shirt. I mean, there's something, I think, quite therapeutic about that.
Well, on that note, this is, I guess we could maybe say the first,
Yes.
I won't say annual yet, but the first digital global symposium.
Yes.
Imagine how we could play with topics and bring in even more student projects
Yeah,
in
and
this
if you
in
have
the future of
ideas
this.
for future
Absolutely.
projects or future people that you would want to bring in or listen to, talk about their work, that would be so welcome, just having your insights. And, you know, for those of you that were here thinking about what went well and what you think can be developed in future projects, that would be really useful feedback as well, if we are thinking about this as a continuum, in a continuum.
So with that, I'm signing us off.
I'm going to clap.
Okay,
Just
we
like-
should all clap.